Expedition 33 is an industry plant. This is something that's very obvious if you pay attention to game journals, if you see just how corrupt gaming YouTubers are, if you see gaming YouTubers who generally refuse to cover RPGs, such as, say, Dark Side Phil or Maximilian Dude. Like, these guys are coming out saying this is like one of the best games of the year and this huge monumental achievement in gaming. Don't believe it. It's all hype, no substance. This is not some major impactful experience. This is not some fresh, new, exciting thing. This is not some original take on the RPG formula. Like, it is just another example of Western game journos trying their hardest to sell you on some game their friends made. Okay, it is an industry plant, and they are going to extreme lengths to try and push this as like a game of the year contender. When in actuality, it's not even really something that anybody who is serious about games is even talking about. It's not something that anybody cares for. Everyone's playing like Kirby Air Riders or Pokemon Legends ZA or like, in my case, old Tales games, like people are playing endless amounts of, superior games than Expedition 33. And there's just this weird, stubborn refusal from the gaming community to acknowledge that there are dozens of games that have come out this year that are better than Expedition 33. This game doesn't do anything like particularly interesting, exciting, fresh, or original. That this is something that is only being propped up to try and gaslight you into thinking the modern video game industry is healing after its dark ages that was established back in 2007. That era where everything looked the same, everything was realistic, everything took itself too seriously. Like, it was all for dude bros, man. This is an evolution of that formula. Expedition 33 is deep and meaningful, and it's just as good of an RPG as Final Fantasy VI. Like, they were legit like throwing those kinds of lines at you when this game first came out. And of course, pretty much every actual JRPG fan ignored it. But that led to kind of like this game having this stereotype of the fans just worshiping this game while shit talking like all of the better RPGs that like real gamers were playing instead. I heard people shit talk Dragon Quest, modern Final Fantasy. I heard people talking shit about Tales. I heard people talking like, oh, Expedition 33 is just going to be as popular and as influential as Final Fantasy 7, which of course is ridiculous, but that's why this is an industry plant. That's why I feel that this is kind of the follow-up to Baldur's Gate 3, because we're never going to get a Baldur's Gate 4. Larian is just going to put out like a derivative IP that they created themselves that nobody cares about, that'll just flop upon release. Like, this was something that the game journos tried to pass off as this independently produced project, when in actuality it has investors, that that it has a publisher, and as a result is by definition not indie. And that's become like a big major issue in the past couple of years, is that we keep seeing like these whimsical, like artsy games being passed off as like independent projects, when in actuality they are not. Dave the Diver, It Takes Two, this, like, all are examples of games that are like passed off as like these independent experiences, when in actuality they're just lower budget games from big publishers. And that's kind of what we're seeing now with like Baldur's Gate 3, with like all of this stuff, is that the term indie has been co-opted to try to just mean like low budget and artsy. And the game journal industry is doing everything they can to try and downplay what they're doing, and try and advocate for absolute nonsense games that nobody's going to even remember like a year from now. Who do you know who even cares about Hi-Fi Rush, or let's see what else, even Baldur's Gate 3 or Astrobot, like all these games that were just like passed off as indie experience, experiences in spite of being like obvious, having obvious big publishers behind them. Like it's laughable. It's stupid, and it really does need to be addressed and called out. It's probably one of the shadiest things about the video game industry at this point. Like it's one of those things that just you see happen over and over and over again, and like nobody else is really addressing it. It's something that like people are just allowing to happen, and it's a shame that we've kind of gone through this weird transitional period where we've moved away from like the PS3 era, PS360 era of like dude bro casual gaming to like just this weird like leftist like terminally online just grift sphere. It's radically different than how things used to be, and I would argue it's actually quite a bit better because I don't feel as if like the gaming industry has the same kind of stranglehold over the industry that it used to. Um, like back in the day, everybody would just hype up like Mass Effect or Portal or like Dead Space or whatever, while like I was playing the far superior Nintendo games. And now it feels like the Nintendo games are actually more popular than the stuff that the industry tried to put out there. We saw this like in 2023 when Tears of the Kingdom outperformed Baldur's Gate 3, and we're seeing it again this year when Donkey Kong Bonanza outperformed pretty much every other nominee on the list. So again, like the industry is healing. People are learning to reject game journal nonsense, and they're kind of becoming the Oscars, where they're kind of just telling people to go support like artsy games that nobody's ever played or heard of. Like they're becoming that kind of award show, and it is something that we as a community really need to push back against and like reboot and destroy. Like this is an award show that simply should not exist. And like I don't really want to hear anything about the Game Awards outside of how irrelevant it is and how like nobody wants to watch it. We're already at that point where like most people are only watching it for the reveal trailers, and I don't even understand why you should do that. Just wait for the trailers to be re-uploaded on YouTube afterward. There's no reason to support the Game Awards for that. So looking at like something like Expedition 33, something that has no credibility whatsoever, something that pretends to be something it isn't, like something that's being worshipped and hyped up only to be discarded and forgotten by next year, right? It's something that we really have to acknowledge and point out that something like this should not be allowed to get the kind of attention it does. There doesn't feel like there's any real debate over what game of the year is going to be. It feels like it was decided back in April. Like it feels like they've been pushing this line all year long, and it is something that does need to be called out. That this game does not deserve any awards whatsoever.